Depending on who you are, this is a moment of catastrophe or triumph. This fallen monument is of 17th century slave trader Edward Colston. The statue was then dragged to the River Avon that once hosted slave ships. And then this happened. This is now a defining moment of the Black Lives Matter protests. If the outrage started over racial violence in America, in the UK the movement has its own life. Amidst the pandemic, over 137,000 people took part in over 200 mostly peaceful protests, forcing the government to respond. But critics say they disproportionately focused on a small number of violent incidents.
I agree with the many peaceful protesters that racism has absolutely no place in our society. Black Lives Matter, but police brutality in the United States is no excuse for the violence against our brave police officers at home. So to the quiet, law-abiding majority who are appalled by this violence and have continued to live their lives within the rules, I hear you.
But does she? Protesters believe that the origins of racist ideas in the UK still remain with us today and are seen in what and who we choose to remember. Everywhere in this country are monuments to Britain's colonial past that some believe should not be a part of this country's future. After the events in Bristol, the question is not only what statue may be targeted next, but what does it tell us about the cultural and political moments sweeping across this nation? And what does it tell us, if anything, about the very nation itself? Attention is now focused on the other high-profile statues facing calls to be removed, like this one of the colonialist Cecil Rhodes at Oxford University, which faces protests tomorrow. Dr. Adam Elliott Cooper is part of the campaign Rhodes Must Fall.
So we have to remember that the transatlantic slave trade and British colonialism are the roots of racism. Racism didn't come first and then colonialism came later. Britain wanted to profit from the resources or the human beings and the land of Africa and the Americas. And so they invented racism in order to justify the exploitation of these people and places. And we're still living with those legacies today. We see it in the criminal justice system, we see it in our healthcare system, and we see it in many other places as well.
The weekend did not just see statues taken down. Although the protests were overwhelmingly peaceful, there were flashpoints with the police too. The Home Secretary promised justice for the police against anger in the Commons over the government's understanding of racial inequality.
This hooliganism is utterly indefensible. There is no justification for it.
Does the Home Secretary actually understand the anger and frustration felt by so many people?
I'm really saddened that the Honourable Lady has effectively said that this government doesn't understand racial inequality. Well, on that basis, Madam Deputy Speaker, it must have been a very different Home Secretary who, as a child, was frequently called a packie in the playground. A very different Home Secretary who was racially abused in the streets, or even advised to drop her surname and use her husband's in order to advance her career.
Britain, famed for having a stiff upper lip, is now openly talking about race and racism. These may be the largest British protests for racial equality on record. So where does this moment go next?
Well, after protesters in Bristol tore down the statue of slave trader Edward Colston, hurling it into the harbour, there's now a debate over what should replace it and how the city should best come to terms with the darker aspects of its past. Our Home Affairs correspondent, Andy Davis, has been getting reaction in Bristol.
In the quiet of the morning, for some in Bristol, this was still a picture to behold. The embers of a protest flaunted around a plinth whose effigy had stood here, immortalised, for 125 years, now erased like the slogans adorning it.
I'm still in the clouds. Yeah, it's kind of funny. I got a turn. I think people be upset, a lot of people be upset about it happened, but they should have really been more upset with that it was still stood there. I think with its history, they could validate it being there before. I'd like to see how you validate replacing it. He's down now. I think that's what that's it, it's done.
Edward Colston, once memorialised as a great philanthropist, yesterday felled as an infamous slave trader. The moment as imbued with the imagery of modern injustice as played out against the symbolism of old. Into the depths of a harbour whose slave trade once powered his ascent, now plunged his statue. And beside the bridge, commemorating a man, Perot Jones, who died in Bristol and who'd been born into enslavement. The historical symmetry, said the historian David Olusoga, was poetic. The problematic legacy of Edward Colston has been a source of considerable debate in this city over the years. Those arguing there was a moral requirement to recast his image more accurately in the shadow of a slave trade he'd done so well from, had made some inroads. The Colston Hall concert venue, despite some opposition, will be renamed this year, like the former Colston's Primary School. But elsewhere, the name looms large. The city has long struggled to agree a new narrative for its former benefactor. Cleo Lake, a former Lord Mayor, had Colston's portrait removed from her office. Now, beside portraits of those fated for fighting for equality, too many opportunities, she argues, were missed.
These things haven't been supported enough. There have been petitions, there have been calls to have a museum, an abolition shed. My stance has always been it's far better to put the statue in a museum and contextualise it and educate people. The calls were made, they weren't listened to.
Decried in some quarters as an act of vandalism, the police today defended their decision not to step in to stop it, claiming it could have sparked widespread violence.
I can't breathe.
Others hope the spotlight on Bristol fuels a wider debate, beginning with education, says one of the organisers of Bristol's Black Lives Matter march.
You know, we've got to grab it from the roots. We've got to have these conversations in school whilst the mind is still kind of learning and growing. That's what I really want to push for.
Every single time it's been a city that has been at the forefront of many fights. You know, the Bristol bus boycotts, it's been at many fights at the forefront, and therefore it's leading the country towards a place of dialogue, really. I know some people, again, might not see that as a dialogue, what happened, but it is opening a lot of questions and discussions about the place of monuments.
On the wall of a museum by Bristol Harbour, a memorial to those enslaved. Colston's disfigured statue may be destined for a museum one day, but not just yet. Few are hurrying to salvage it.
Andy Davis reporting. Well, we asked to speak to someone from the government. No one was available to appear on the programme tonight. But a short time ago, I spoke to the Conservative MP for Hitchin and Harpenden, Bim Afalami. I began by asking him whether he agreed with the Prime Minister that the protest had been subverted by thuggery.
Yes, I do. The peaceful protest and campaigning for social justice and improved economic opportunities for black people and other minority ethnic groups is welcome. It's exactly what many people would like to do. But for a small, violent minority to do senseless violence and deface war memorials and public monuments and statues, that is not the way we do things in this country. And those people, that minority, are thugs.
But you said it yourself, that minority, but not, by saying they've been subverted by thuggery, you're tarnishing the entire movement, which is, to a large extent, a peaceful protest.
Well, I think subverted is the key point. There have been some people who've decided to use this as an opportunity to behave like thugs and behave violently. Indeed, the Home Secretary, in her statement to the House of Commons this afternoon, in which I asked a question, made a very similar point. She said the majority were doing this peacefully, but a minority, I think, has undermined the whole message for the public. And I think that's a shame.
So she, Priti Patel, called this minority repulsive criminals who will be brought to justice immediately. I just wonder where the outrage was from this government, the outrage I'm talking about, when the Windrush scandal happened, or indeed before that, when we had the deaths in police custody of Rashan Charles, Sean Rigg, or Roger Sylvester. It seems that the statues get more outrage than people who die or are mistreated by the system.
No, I think that's completely unfair. And in fact, the Home Secretary started her statement today by expressing her disgust in what happened to George Floyd in the United States. So no, I think that's completely unfair.
So where do we go from here? I mean, she wants these people brought to justice, but how does any of that actually improve, you know, race relations in this country, which is what we're really talking about?
Well, there are two sides to this. We've got to work on economic opportunities and social justice for Black people and other minority ethnic groups. Black people are much more likely to have lower levels of savings. They're much more likely to work in shutdown industries. You know, these are, you know, so the sharp end of this is going to be falling on groups that are already disadvantaged. In the economic recovery, we need to focus on that. And that's one of the things that, you know, we need to be talking about going forward.
The Prime Minister also said today that Britain is not a racist country. I wonder if you, as a Black man growing up in Britain, have ever come across any racism?
Of course, there's nobody who's Black or of any minority ethnic group or Jewish who has not, you know, who has not experienced or come across racism. Indeed, probably a large number of your white viewers have seen and come across racism. The important thing is to notice where we have come from and how far we've gone.
So let me just ask you personally then, describe to me an example of racism against you in particular and how that affected you.
Look, I'm not going to get into sort of personal.
Why not?
The point, well, because, you know, I think that the broad point here is, of course, if you're any minority ethnic person, you've experienced, you know, racism at certain times from a very small minority. Of course, that's happened. But the point is, how far are we going? It is much less prevalent than it was. We're moving forward as a society. We need to continue doing that. And of course, it's always important to say it's the minority, and the majority of people in this country are fair-minded, want equal opportunity for everybody. And that's the majority we all need to get behind and move forward in a peaceful way towards improved social and economic opportunities for everybody. And that, you know, that needs to be the focus of what so much of that we do.
We're joined now by the Professor of Public History and broadcaster David Olusoga, who is in Bristol, and the Bishop of Dover, Rose Hudson-Wilkin, the first Black woman to become a Church of England bishop. She joins us from Canterbury in Kent. David Olusoga, what does it say of a Britain that has a statue to such a man still standing 300 years after his death?
Well, I think that's what most people are surprised about. When the news broke, most people couldn't believe that there was a statue in Bristol of a man who was a slave trader and, by dint of being a slave trader, a mass murderer. It's a disgrace. It's something that people in this city have fought about for decades. There has been attempt after attempt, appeal after appeal, petition after petition to have that statue removed. And what happened on Sunday should never have happened, because the statue should have been taken down decades ago.
Bishop Rose, is Britain more comfortable talking about a small minority of violent protesters rather than of a campaign for racial equality?
Sadly, it would appear so, and that makes me very sad indeed. I think what you saw is utter frustration from a people who have been asking nicely, asking through democratic means to say this does not sit comfortably with us, and then left with feeling that they have no other choice. Personally, I wouldn't be taking the statue down. I would be putting up a plaque because it is part of history. And I think one of the things that is hugely lacking in this country is our history and
Bishop,
the implication. Hello?
I'm sorry that your sound just broke up there, but I think we got the sense of what you were saying. You wouldn't condone it, would you, Mr. Olusoga?
I'm not going to.
And would you no?
I'm not going to tell the protesters what they did was wrong, because I live in this city and I understand the decades and decades of frustration. It is a standing insult to ask people whose ancestors were chained to the decks of the ships of the Royal Africa Company, of which Edward Colston was the deputy governor, to live with it, to accept it, to just not be offended by it. Of course, it's a deeply offensive thing to do. And after decades of asking politely, as the bishop said, they got nowhere. There has been petitions. There was an attempt to put a plaque on to do exactly as the bishop suggests, contextualise it, and that was muted and watered down last year.
Well, I want to get to education, which both of you have a great interest in. As we learned when we were at school, we would learn of William Wilberforce, but we never heard of Edward Colston and his historic role in shipping 84,000 people as slaves across the world. I mean, Bishop, doesn't this demand a change? I'm sure it hasn't changed today. Does it not ask a new kind of approach to children's education?
Oh, absolutely. We need a new curriculum, a curriculum that reflects history as the correct history, not just seen through British eyes. It really is important. And it is because of this lack of education why we have such ignorance, because that's where racism comes from. It comes from a place of ignorance.
David Olusoga, I mean, of course, people will also say, why tinker with history? The fact is that's what happened, that's how it was seen, and that's how it has to be taught.
But histories are not the mechanism by which we don't learn history from statues. The statue was put up in 1895. Colston died in 1721. It is a history there, but it's a completely different history about late Victorian Bristol. The history that we learn through books and we learn through television programs, not statues. If you stood in front of the statue, you would learn nothing about the Atlantic slave trade, and you would learn very little about the truth of the life of Edward Colston, because statues are immutable. They cannot change. They cannot adapt. They can't tell us history because that's not their function. Their function is to say, here is a great man. Edward Colston wasn't a great man. He was an evil man.
But would the curriculum ever have tackled this? I mean, that's the question I'm wondering. Is there a real approach to a multi-ethnic, multiracial society? Do children emerge from learning history at school understanding that we are a very diverse and brilliant society?
They don't, because the parts of the history that would make sense to them, that would tell their stories, are omitted. So we tell abolition, but we don't tell the story of the slave trade. We'll talk about the Industrial Revolution. We won't talk about the cotton that came from the enslaved people in America to fuel those mills in Lancashire. We tell half-truths, half-histories, and that is no longer viable in a country that by the middle of this century will be 1/3 BAME. We need to find a new history that is going to work for the country we are and the country that we're going to become.
We hear about Wilberforce. No one tells us about Olada Akriana. So history is one-sided, and until history is shared in the proper way, we will continue to have the ignorance that encourages the racism that we see today in all institutions within this country and the world, in effect.
Bishop, do you think racial equality should be at the very heart of what might have to be a written constitution?
Racial equality, justice, every human being being treated with respect should be at the heart of any form of constitution or humanity living together. And until we have that, we will have the economic injustices. We will have the injustices with policing, with the criminal justice system, with housing, with the health, education. We have to change. And I think this is a moment we should not let go by. We need to calm the rhetoric and not just call people all sorts of names. And we need to find a way through this. And we don't just want words anymore. So many words have gone by. We don't want people to tell us that we should be grateful for what we have, because actually this is not a black problem. It is exhibiting itself. It is a white problem. And if it is a white problem, then it is a problem for all of us. And we need to work for change.
Bishop Rose.
Change.
Bishop Rose Hudson Wilkin, thank you very much indeed. And David Olusoga, thank you very much, both of you, for joining us. Thank you.